Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. My name's Peter. This is Catch Up, a show where we get to talk with interesting people, and there are very few people I've been more excited to chat to than this guest we have today. Stuart Sayger is a comic book artist with an insane, huge career spanning work with DC, Warner Brothers, Lego, his own self-published work with Shiver in the Dark over 20 years ago, and then the re-release and new issues of that series last year into this year. So he's just had this really incredible trajectory. I first saw his work when he was doing the Lego Bionicle books in 2006, 2007, and have really always thought those were some of the most interesting stuff I'd read, and I love Bionicle and that fan community, so I still have a lot of those issues. I was recently able to get some of his work signed and was able to connect with him that way and get him on the show, so very, very excited to talk to Stuart today. I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. We get into some really fun stuff about his story and things that he's been able to be involved in. And also just general advice for those that want to create things, whether it's comic books or music or acting or art of any kind. So very excited for you to hear that. Let's jump into it. Yeah, so I want to kind of jump into it and talk about your whole story as an artist and things like that. And if we can, just to jumpstart for the listeners, if you can give kind of a brief summary of your work and what you've done in the comics industry and your art and what that's been like.
Sure thing. So the first thing I think to start with is I'm self-taught. I actually haven't been to art school. I studied journalism in college, but going all the way back to my We Taught days, I sort of have this background in comic books anyway. I typed up a little resume and I got a job in a comic book store when I was 13. I worked there through junior high school, and a lot of college, well, all of college, but home more for summer breaks and Christmas and stuff like that. But then in high school, my high school had a pretty good high school newspaper, and I went to Indiana University, which had a really strong daily newspaper. And so while I didn't take art classes, in both cases, I worked for the school paper. And by the time I was at Indiana University, I was kind of their go-to guy for illustration for a couple of years. Now, there were a couple other guys who did some illustration, and everybody had a different style. And some people would be good for one job. Some people could do both. I always thought this was kind of how the real world worked. I wanted every job, period. So I got in there, and I sort of made myself the reliable guy. You need a piece, I'll do it. What style do you need? I can do it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but that is a really, really great training ground to draw comics.
Yeah.
You learn to draw for reproduction. You learn to work for an editor. When I got out of college, I self-published a horror comic book called Shiver in the Dark. I published issue 1. People want to know where was issue 2. Okay, I have to make a second issue. Then I made a second, a third. And I was working on the 4th when I get approached by DC Comics, an editor there, to try out for Lego.
Okay.
The Bionicle book.
Yeah.
And I thought there was no chance I would get the job simply because my style is kind of loose and painterly. But they really encouraged me to do something different. Lego had been making the comic book with DC for a couple of years, and they were considering maybe going another route to advertise their toys. And DC said, whoa, let us have a chance to reimagine this for you. And truth be told, DC basically pitched them a different view of the book, and Lego said, yeah, we like this, let's keep it going. And that's where I come on. From there, I had a 2-year run on that, and I ended up doing lots of work for DC and Warner Brothers. Beyond that, I worked on a Superman, Man of Steel movie. I did a lot of Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman t-shirts, backpacks, coffee mugs, stuff like that. I've done a Walking Dead variant cover. Of late, the last couple of years, I've been working largely with Dynamite, the publisher, doing mostly covers for them. So I've done Army of Darkness, 28 covers for Kiss, the rock band, Gene Simmons and those people. I've done Evil Ernie. I did a couple G.I. Joe covers. I've done Transformers. Am I done? No, there are other things. I've done several Deja Thoris. What's something really big and exciting that I've left off? I did the 30 Days of Night comic. I can't, at some point, if I had them all out in front of me, it would look bigger than it feels. But if you do something for 20 years, they do kind of add up.
Oh, yeah.
And the funny thing about the comic book industry is it looks really big, but it's actually really pretty small. You've got 2 major publishers, Marvel and DC, and then you've got smaller publishers under there that put out some quality books, but they don't put out, this large library all the time. And there really aren't that many people who are full-time comic book artists in this country. You know, you add it all up, I don't know if there are 1,000 of us, and that counts pencilers, inkers, colorists.
Wow.
You know, and you think, so there aren't a ton to it. In my case, I kind of wanted to break into it, and instead of waiting to be hired, I just published a book and sold it. And in my case, the powers that be, they're smart, they pay attention. What do people want? What's selling? My book sold well enough. And then an editor was looking for a particular art style and just looked to see what was in front of him and said, ask that guy right there. And that's happened to me on Bionicle, but that happened to me on lots of other jobs. That's how I got the Superman job.
Really? Just based on them choosing stylistically the direction they wanted to go and then kind of saying, oh, well, this is someone who's been successful in that. Like, clearly people like the work.
I hate to say it. I think it works more like that than people want to admit. And I was, there was an editor I'd worked for at DC I liked pretty well, not on Bionicle, but he had done a lot of products for DC Comics that weren't proper comic books, like they were outside of comics. He was involved with manufacturing T-shirts, posters, toys, statues. And anytime I talked to him, he had just this incredible Rolodex in his head and on his computer of artists he liked.
Wow.
And he showed me really skilled artists on his computer one time, and he'd say, oh, this is the guy who's really good. And I'd say, oh, I don't know that guy's work. What's he done? And he said, I don't know if he's done anything, but I've been following him. He turned up, I met him either at a convention or I saw his stuff online and I thought it was unique. And when I need this sort of thing, I need to know where it is. So it's kind of funny. I think editors, you know, they're not the writer, they're not the artist. They don't get as much of the glory, but they really have to have a good understanding of how the industry works. And, you know, if I got sick on Bionicle or something like that happened and I couldn't fulfill my issue, I'm guessing my editor had a backup plan. There was a guy who was probably number 2 for the job behind me, and I made sure he never got a chance.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one of those where I'm sure that half of it is they know the style they want and they're going to find the guy that can do that, but then half of it is who's the guy that will do it no matter what, or he can get it done, you know. And what you mentioned about earlier art stuff and kind of going through the gauntlet of doing that and being able to do any style anytime, I'm sure that's a huge part of it.
It's huge, and you know, how what's the quality of your work is obviously a question, but also how reliable are you? How fast are you? And I've never had any trouble with this, but how difficult to work with are you?
Yeah.
You know, do you take corrections? There were a few things that I was asked to alter on Lego. It made total sense. And I said, oh yeah, I should draw it this different way. There were a few things where I read the script and I said, fellas, this doesn't work. We have to make a panel here, add a panel, subtract something. And they usually agreed with me. Very rarely was there a situation where one side didn't suggest something to the other that the other side didn't say, yeah, that's a better idea. The trick is to choose those right moments, not add more work for somebody, but actually help everybody.
Yeah.
And if you do that, I think that matters a lot, because most of the people in comics are pretty overworked.
Yeah.
And they are.
Well, that's what it seems like would be the case with the amount of people versus the amount of output. That there's a lot of comic books coming out all the time, but from what you're describing, there's not a ton of people creating them. And I feel like I see that just kind of casually looking at a rack of comics that have come out in a week and seeing that, you know, the same writer or the same artist is doing a couple of those. It's like, wow, that's an incredible workload. I can't even imagine, you know, turning out that caliber of work multiple times a month. That, yeah, I'm sure it just stretches you thin.
I think that can happen, but I think the other thing is anybody learns how to streamline whatever it is they're working on, pretty much. Also, people can reach their breaking point, and this doesn't get talked about enough, but, you know, I had an editor one time who called me on Monday afternoon, and he said, we had like 8 pages left to go in a comic book. He said, can you get the whole thing done by Wednesday? And I thought, Wednesday? And so he and I communicated pretty well, and we knew each other, and I could joke with him a little bit. And I said, you know what? I can have the whole thing done before dinner today. You just know what it'll look like. And so he said, yeah, okay, but how does the deadline look? What can we do to get there? And sometimes there are situations where this one point, whatever it is the thing that has to be met. We have to hit this particular deadline. It's very unrealistic. What can we do to get there? Or, you know, you may have a panel sometime Lego never had this happen too often, but it could be a situation like we're launching 8 new toys. I need 8 new toys in this panel. I've only got 4 inches. Well, they all
Yeah.
have to be there. And sometimes things aren't for discussion. And so you have to say, okay, well, how do I get 8? How do I show 8 things on one panel?
Yeah.
And it just has to be done. So you get hired to not only just know how to draw, but to some extent, you're a little bit of a problem solver,
Mm.
right? You can be a little bit of a script tweaker. I don't really tweak a script that much, but very often a writer will come up with very great events, but they won't be broken into panels that work well as panels. I might say
Sure.
I have to slow this action up, or speed this up.
Yeah.
This page won't work the way it's laid out. And that used to be all you had to do. And now, and this leads back to what you're talking about earlier that you started the show with, more than ever, we have to wear so many different hats. I go to comic book conventions and I meet fans, I sign autographs, I answer questions, I do something like this. But at the same time, I'm doing that not just for me, but I'm really representing the companies I work for. If a new Kiss comic comes out, I've got to go and meet Kiss fans. And if I draw Gene Simmons well, one of the first things they ask me is, "What's my favorite Kiss song?"
Yeah.
I will be better at the job if I'm invested.
Sure.
And I think the fans will know that I've done a better job if I'm invested.
Mm.
So what are all the things we have to do? Kiss, when I got the Kiss job, one of the first things I did was I thought, I got to listen to some Kiss records.
Yeah.
I just wanted to get caught up with the material again. So, and then we're doing more and more online. We're doing more and more technological stuff. I always feel bad when something like a skill that's kind of a traditional skill like drawing gets, how can I put this? It can start to be marginalized. There can be some people who can be really, really good at drawing, and maybe they can't work in this industry to the level they'd like. Maybe they don't have the technology savvy.
Yeah.
Maybe they can't travel. Maybe, I've seen it where people can have fear of crowds, and a publisher would say, "Gosh, if I'm going to publish your book, I really want you to sit at the table and get people excited." And so people may say, "I'm really not good at that." Well,
Right.
you're less attractive as a writer at that point.
Yeah. 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 That's got to be a tricky balance where, especially with something like drawing or writing, it can be a pretty solitary art form that you go away, you create something, then you deliver it later. I mean, I always think of that, the stories that you would hear about like Jack Kirby when he was at his creative peak and creating all these gigantic, impressive things, but he was just sitting in his basement with a cup of coffee all day long, didn't want to do these like press junkets and appearances and things like that. And it's like a weird balance, but the work speaks for itself. But nowadays there's so many people trying to break in, trying to do the same thing, that it's like you got to be out there to some extent, or that's the expectation, that you'd be out there putting your face to your work.
Well, therein lies the value of having a Stan Lee.
Yeah, that's true.
I think the thing that can't be overlooked about Stan is that he was just that charismatic.
Yeah.
The work is good. Fantastic Four is a great looking comic book, but then to have somebody come up there and really give the song and dance and make you fall in love with it and give it a chance and be likable, that's really important.
Yeah.
Carl Perkins wrote Blue Suede Shoes. It was a great song, but look what happens when Elvis Presley gets a hold of it.
Right.
I mean, these are the realities we deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. I think I think about the Lego stuff and the things that the platform that afforded your work, I think probably gave it that presence for a lot of people, which is to say, like, you self-publish a book to break into the industry, and that's a big feat. I mean, that's not something that
Huge.
that everybody does, right? I think of that as like, okay, that's like the same story as, Eastman and Laird self-publishing Ninja Turtles because nobody wants to touch it, and it becomes something that like defines their path into the industry. What was
so we're having more and more of that than ever.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. But also, you aren't doing that now. You did that ahead of the curve, I would say, with Shiver in the Dark, and that's like, before that was like a much more common thing that people would say, I'll just print a couple copies, I'll take it around to some local shops, I'll, whatever. Like, I think that's happening a lot more now. Indie publishers are becoming a lot more, they have a lot more presence.
The big difference here is I think I did kind of get in at the last breath that it
Mm.
was a unique thing to put out a self-published comic book. And the biggest thing that changed that there is the quality you can get now from really low print or low print run digital printing.
Mm.
Shiver in the Dark was offset printed. You're
Mm.
not going to offset print anything unless you're going to get thousands of copies.
Right.
If you and I were in high school and we said, gosh, let's make a comic book, if you write it and I draw it, can we scrape together, a couple $100 and print some copies? Yeah, we probably could do that. A couple $100 wouldn't do anything when I started doing this.
Yeah.
I pretty much had to dive in at, I don't remember what it was, but it was, $2,000. I never
Wow.
spent $2,000 on anything.
Yeah.
In fact, and this is a funny story, I bought my first print run of Shiver in the Dark, and it triggered a credit card fraud warning.
Oh no.
Right, because I'd never bought anything anywhere near that type or that size. And
Yeah.
so the credit card company called and they said, "Hi, we're calling because we think we have some fraudulent behavior on your card." And I thought, "Oh no." And they read what it was and they said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "Actually, that is mine." And I kid you not, the voice on the other line said, "You're kidding me. Man, I was sure I got one for real this time." Okay, well, have a good day. That really happened.
That's great.
But that sort of speaks to how much the needle had moved. Because I remember the first time I set up for a show, I could have my book laying out. And you also talk about how this was a different time. I remember there were many customers the first couple of years I did this. They walked up and saw the book, and just by reading the title and looking at the flavor of the art on the cover, their reaction was to ask, "Is this a horror comic book?" And I said,
Mm.
"Yes, it is." And I remember several people saying, "I'll take it. There aren't any."
Mm.
So there was no Walking Dead. There was no 30 Days of Night. This was a genre that was kind of sitting there quietly sleeping. No one was paying attention to it. Everything that anybody was making kind of looked like Jim Lee X-Men or
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
Image comic book.
I was gonna say
And
very,
it
very like pulpy pen and ink, like yeah, that
a
that
lot of grit.
style. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No powers.
Patches and
Yeah. But anyway, so that really helped. And that allowed me to have a situation where there was an audience that was hungry. I'd come up with something to scratch an itch. And I always tell people this, if you guys are listening, you're creative people, it's really easy to fall in love with thing X and say, I'll make my version kind of like that. And
mm.
for all the people who tried to make X-Men like comic books back then, I used to say to them, look, I know you love this stuff and then you're trying to break in, but you're probably out of the gate not going to make a better quote unquote X-Men comic than Marvel's doing.
Right.
Okay. So you're already at a disadvantage there. I would figure that if a fan really likes X-Men, they're going to buy X-Men. And if they want more of that, they're probably not going to buy your books. They're probably going to buy X Factor.
Right.
And if that's not enough and they won't buy your books, they're going to buy X-Force.
Yep.
And if that's not enough, they might buy Wolverine. And I always said, how far down the list does somebody have to get where they say yours is the best one left? In my case, I had all these people who just said, I'll take any horror thing I can get. There isn't any.
Yeah.
I really felt that gave me at least a chance to get somebody's eyes in a way that so many other self-published comics just didn't have that opportunity.
Mm.
So
yeah, that's
if
really
you want to make
interesting.
something like this,
Creating
don't try to get a home run, but try to get a really reliable, easy single.
Yeah.
Make enough copies that you can sell it, identify a particular audience, sell those, and you know what? Your next book will do better. But get the first one done.
Was that surprising that when that first issue did well enough that people were asking for the second and you were like, oh, I actually, I did it? Whether or not you could kind of see into the future enough to say that this can build a full-time job, like at least the feeling of, oh, there's like demand for a second issue. What was that feeling like?
It was horror. I'm not kidding because if you've never made a comic book, like I can draw a comic book in a month easily. I mean, that's just what you have to do these days. But knowing nothing about it back then, I spent the better part of a year making that comic book.
Mm.
I mean, first of all, I didn't just write it or draw it. I had to letter it, color it, publish it. I had to set up the files for digital printing, which I'd never really done much of that before.
Yeah.
I had to call printers, coordinate all that. And I had never done a comic book convention. I had to buy a table. It literally was like I had to figure out how to contact Wizard to buy a table at Wizard Chicago. It was the first show I did. And so I did it. I sold it. It sold pretty well. I had this glow. It really kind of felt like whether it did well or not, my goal was to make my comic book, and it did well. The horror was when I came home. The next day, woke up, checked my email, and people said, I like this book. When does number 2 come out? And even dreaming about making number 2 seemed impossible. It seemed like I was lucky to have climbed the mountain once.
Yeah.
Now, the truth is, once you've done it, it's easier the second time.
Really? That's once you've kind of knocked it out?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of it. You just so number 1, you can do it because you've done it. Okay? And a lot of the things you had to invent and figure out how to do, you don't invent them. You just do what you did again. And then by the time you do the 3rd or 4th book, you realize, oh, the thing I had been doing all this time was a bad idea. Here's a better way to do it, or a faster way.
Yeah.
You get better. You get smarter. You meet other people who say, why are you doing this? You should do this instead. Of course. So it does get easier. The funny thing is, when I first made Shiver in the Dark, I was hoping to sell some of them for sure. But I was well aware that it's possible that one of the things I would do with it would be I would just give it to an editor. It would be almost like a business card. I made this. I'm looking to get hired.
Right.
And after I had people asking for issue 2, I threw myself into issue 2 and then 3 and was working on 4. And about that time, I wasn't looking for work anymore. I had made enough fans. The book was selling well enough. It looked like I had my own momentum, my own thing. And that was when I got asked to work for these companies rather than I was asking them if they had any jobs.
Yeah.
But a couple of things that happened, and this is what I want you guys to really hear because this is true. I remember being at shows with Shiver in the Dark and meeting editors who looked at what I was doing. And I remember one of them was a DC editor who said, can't name names because they weren't rude, but they had so much color. Yeah. They looked at my work and they said, it's pretty good, kid. Keep it up. I don't think you're quite ready yet there, but you got some good stuff. Let me see your next issue. And so this kind of talks to what I said about Kevin. They want to see who's up and coming. I don't know how much I was on the radar of the person who asked me to try out for Lego. It may have been that I wasn't on that person's radar at all. But he may have gotten together with the other editors in the room and said, I need something kind of like this. Does anybody know anybody? I do know that at a convention in Philadelphia, I had some copies of Shiver in the Dark there, and a DC editor asked if they could take them back to the office. And it was only a couple months after that I got asked to try out for Lego. For all I know, they just happened to be laying on the table, and they said, what about this guy?
Yeah. And that's part of the self-publishing thing, too. Like, for other people who just have maybe a packet or they have some an online portfolio or they don't have the same level of finished self-published product, they don't really have a chance for that thing to just be sitting on a table somewhere because it doesn't exist. But for you had that leg up where if that is the way that connection was made, you had the chance for it to actually be physically in their hands.
I know I got a job at Wizard magazine that very way. They had a print from Shiver in the Dark that I'd made, and someone had bought it at a convention, and they hung it in the office, and they were looking to hire an artist for a drawing of Frankenberry, Count Chocula, and Boo Berry as horror characters. And they said, who should we get for it? And they told me this in a conference room, and somebody said, let's get that guy. And they just read my name off of it. But that's how it happens.
Yeah.
I will say this, though. What you're saying, I really believe in. And my proof in the pudding for this, for me, was even though I didn't go to art school, when I was in college, I knew the art school kids. They knew, they had the best rock and roll bands. They had the coolest clothes. They were always fun to hang out with. And I remember when it came time for everybody to graduate, okay, what do we do with art now? They had a portfolio of paintings they had done or whatever. I had a book of clippings. You made a painting of a tree. I made a painting of a tree that you used on a calendar.
Yeah.
I'm published. I can go after commercial jobs in a way that you don't really have. You can do it.
Sure.
But there's a big, big difference between being in print already and then seeking to be in print.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one thing, if I have any criticism with art school, and I can only say this having never been to art school, is they teach you how to paint well, teach you how to draw well, teach you a lot about color theory. I wish that they would have you take one basic business class, one improv comedy class, so you learn how to read people better. You're better at negotiation and communication, and tell people to get out there and they have to compete. It's there's a college in Florida called Wrangling, and it's an illustration college, and it's really near. I think it's in Orlando, but it's really near MegaCon. And I haven't been to MegaCon for years, but that's a big convention in Florida. Ringling used to buy like 20 tables in Artist Alley and tell their kids to set up there and try to sell their stuff. And what
Yeah.
I loved about that was it meant those kids were competing against me, and I was having to compete against Jim Lee,
Right.
and all that is hard.
Yeah.
And rather than sitting in your art class and collecting your A's and getting patted on the head, you get thrown out with the wolves
Right.
and find out how hard it is. Because believe me, uh, I know you want to sell something, but I want every dollar in the room. And the only dollars I'm going to get are ones that Jim Lee doesn't take.
Right. Right.
Right. So get in line if you think you're getting some. And
Yeah.
that's a hard lesson. And it takes a lot of guts for an art school to expose their kids to that, because otherwise that could be a little too daunting and have some children say, maybe this isn't for me. Whereas I
Right.
think the art school could have just sort of held high and say, we aren't interested in finances. We are interested in teaching painting,
Right.
which is
Right.
high-minded, but not terribly practical.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. And some of it has to do with, from what you're describing of your own story, it seems like the self-starter mentality that maybe you think you're gonna I want to go to art school because all I want to do is paint a tree, and it's like, and that's great, but if you don't have the mentality that, and then I have to get somebody to put that on a calendar, or I have to get somebody to, hire me to draw a character for a book, or for, if you don't have that kind of thing, then you could get dropped at one of those tables at MegaCon and think, well, I don't know, I'm not really interested in this side, or I don't want anything to do with this, and it's that can spiral you out of that world.
Or it can lead you down another path. If you say, I know this isn't for me, if I'm going to have a career in this, then I have to consider getting an agent,
Yeah.
which I don't know if art school teaches kids how to navigate getting an agent. It's, if you like to eat pizza, that's a reasonable reaction. But then to say, well, I love eating pizza, that must mean that I want to work in a pizza shop. It doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
They're not quite the same thing. But so I think it's kind of a good idea to see all the pieces.
Yeah.
But I will tell you this, I love it. I am self-motivated. I got the job at the comic book store when I was 13 because I typed up a resume. I didn't go and ask for a job application. I wrote a resume. I brought it to them. And I always feel like 9 times out of 10, somebody, if you want to work at a deal with somebody, you need to figure out what it is they want. And usually what they want is an easy win. Make it easy for them to get something they want out of it.
Yep.
And you bring them the deal and they'll say, yes, this sounds great. They're rarely going to be very interested in helping you.
Sure.
If you can show how you're going to help them, but you benefit from it as well, that's the way to get some things done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really neat. I was curious to hear, because you talk about kind of this upward, we're going up to, you have the comic book store, but then you have getting the Shiver in the Dark self-published, and then Lego, and then kind of from there, there's this, explosion of stuff that you've worked on with DC and with Warner Brothers and things like that. Was there anything in that list that you were like, either you got it and it was a dream come true, or it was right there and it was, I could have this, I could be drawing the Superman movie poster, I could have, and it was maybe close and it didn't work out, or there's still a chance one day. But what's the stuff in that world?
I got a
that
few.
It's like,
So Lego was not my first job. Lego was about my second.
Okay.
I had gotten to do some trading cards for DC, and they were great. I loved drawing those. They were the perfect first job for me, because they were small. They'd say, okay, kid, make us 4 illustrations. I need one of Superman, one of Gorilla Grodd. You don't have to draw anything terribly difficult. I don't have to draw, Superman. Drawing Superman's easy. What's hard is drawing Clark Kent's trying to clean his desk.
Yeah.
Okay, what's an old-fashioned typewriter look like? What's a believable 1950s desk that's been in use, stuff like that. But then I was offered the Lego job, and that really was a big break, because that was regular work. It wasn't that I was going to do one issue. It was multiple issues. I got to plan my year, and it was a lot of work. The thing that became evident was if I took that, I was not going to get to work on Shiver in the Dark #4. And it was kind of a heartbreaker, because I really wanted to do that, but I had to be aware that this was a really great opportunity. It paid well.
Yeah.
And I wanted that as well. But to recognize that was going to be a different degree of responsibility, and that I was going to have to change my behavior and my workflow was going to have to change. The first issue was like a poster and a cover. Okay, that's not a lot of work. But the next issue was double sized. It was 20 pages, something like that.
Wow.
Okay, well, the first Shiver in the Dark was 20 pages.
Yeah.
And I just told you it took me a better part of a year to make that.
Yeah.
So I had to say, whatever you did to get Shiver in the Dark #1 made, that's not going to cut it on this. So that was really ratcheting up. I like to mention this. I've seen a couple different interviews with the members of the Beatles. And I think it's George Harrison. He usually says this. He said, the thing was they got together when they were like 15 or 16 years old. He said every next step, about the time it arrived, we were ready for it. And I kind of feel like that was sort of the case for me. If I don't think I could have done the Lego job or had the ability to do it without doing the Shiver in the Dark stuff.
Yeah.
You kind of have to build up to it. And I think a lot of good editors and publishers, they can look at you and tell. Now, I will tell you this. There are lots of things I would still love to work on. I think that a lot of creators fall into artists, that is, fall into one of two camps. And I'm always surprised by this. I know a lot of artists who just want to draw or paint. That's it. I know others that are absolutely through and through storytellers. They are just as interested in writing as they are drawing. And I always was sure when I was young that if you wanted to make comic books, that you were absolutely interested in writing. And I found out that's not the case. I love to write. My favorite things to work on are my own things. Frankly, just because I can be more invested in it. It's kind of like you just have more skin in the game. You connect with it more. You're taking a bigger risk. You're exposing yourself a little bit more.
Yeah.
I had a conversation one time with Bill Sienkiewicz, an artist I really admire. And he's a fantastic artist. I mean, at least in the world of comic books, he may be one of the most skilled guys we've ever had. His abilities are so broad.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, so I feel like you've slayed this dragon. You can paint, you can do caricature, you can watercolor, you can, 100 guys draw a Batman. Yours is going to be one of the very best in the room. And I said, but why don't you write something? I said, I feel like you've already conquered this. That seems like it's still hanging out there. And he acted like I punched him in the gut, but in the best way. He just said, yeah, you're right. He said, I'd love to do it. And I said, really living is being on the tightrope and not having the net.
Yeah.
Being able to fail.
Right.
And I could tell I touched a nerve. And to this day, he's one of my favorite artists.
Yeah.
But I'd love to see that thing. I think that's what he got out of doing his Marvel Comics Stray Toasters, where he wrote it. And a lot of people said it was weird, or they didn't like it, or they didn't get it. And I kind of feel like he did that. So he was out on the limb. I think it's a great book. And a lot of other people do too. But I feel like it's been a while since he's had that really big risk.
Yeah.
I think anybody who's making comics needs to avoid working themselves into the situation where they feel like they have no risk. If you are, and I'm picking a name out of my hat here, okay? But if you are John Byrne and you have drawn everything and drawn everything well, and somebody says, hey, will you do Superman? Will you do Spider-Man? Do Batman? Those are all mountains he's climbed, and he knows he can climb again. And the key is, if he just knows he can climb it again, there's not much challenge there. He has to find a way to re-engage it. At least I do.
Yeah.
So those are the best jobs. That's when it's most creative. I always kind of wondered how do some creators work on something for, 50, 60 years? There are guys who've done it. How do you draw Garfield every day or write Garfield every day? I mean, you can do it. Sure. But you have to reinvent yourself.
Yeah. And after a point, there's probably no risk. You hit a point where you could do anything with it and it wouldn't hurt, the income and the fandom and the whatever. And there's some gray area there where it's like, I wish that there was more adventure to be had in it. I mean, I think of recently Alex Ross publishing Fantastic Four Full Circle, and that is a departure in both his methodology because he wrote it, but also the art style is completely different. And that is like a risk. That's something that you don't see from people all the time. Just saying, I'm going to rehash someone else's old story in a new medium. I'm going to do all, and it's a departure, but I think that it has worked well. And the result, even if the result is only personal creative satisfaction, is still a very good result. Because,
Totally.
He may go back to doing Avengers covers that look like Alex Ross paintings tomorrow, and that's great. But if he feels more fulfilled doing that because he's done the self-expression, that's great.
The fulfillment matters. The challenge matters. I think having respect for the material matters. You don't want everyone to get jaded. You don't want to ever get. I mean, it's weird. I've seen people get annoyed by fans or annoyed by the paparazzi or whatever, and I think you kind of feel like have to accept all of this is part of the beast. If you ever get to where you can't handle a piece of it, then it can break all of it.
Right.
When I was a lot younger, I saw the Stone Temple Pilots play concert one time, and I wish I remembered exactly what Scott Weiland said. They came out and they played their first song, and after they played their first song, the crowd's going wild, and then everybody retunes a little bit and gets ready, and he adjusts his chair. I wish I remember what he said, but he leaned up to the microphone and he said something kind of like, "I think it's time for some rock and roll." And everybody went nuts and they lost their mind. And right when he did that, he looked over at the guitarist and he kind of just looked of like, "Man, this is easy." Like, and it wasn't like, I hope it wasn't that he had no respect for the crowd, because I don't think that was it. But it was just sort of like, it was their second album, and I think they'd gotten through the first tour. Now they're on their second record, and they're seasoned. They know what they're doing, and they put on a really good show. And there was something about that comment and how it just won everybody over. And he looked at the guitarist and it was kind of like, "We have them."
Yeah.
So if it's the other way around and he had no respect for us, I don't think the show could have been very good.
Sure.
And I really mean that.
Yeah.
It's you don't believe what you're doing, it all sort of loses momentum. But if it was him pumping people up and he looks over and he says, "Okay, let's do it now," then it's great.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's why I think people still talk about, people go see Bob Dylan or they go see artists who are still doing it, but they're doing it their own way. And they don't just go up and kind of just play the 5 hits and go home and come, whatever. Like, they still have the artistic element. And that brings us to something that I wanted to ask you about, which is,
Sure.
you brought back Shiver in the Dark after this extended hiatus where you've had this illustrious, DC and Warner Brothers and Lego and all these other gigs. And you're able to return to something that's wholly self-created and has, much, like you said, much more personal investment and personal risk to it. And what was that experience like? I mean, what was the moment, I guess first, what was the moment that you were like, "Oh, I can do this. I have the chance now to go back and do what I wanted to do right before Lego called me"?
I'd been wanting to do it since the moment Lego called me. Like, I want to get back to this. I want to get back to this. There was a time I thought I was going to do it, and I got the Man of Steel job. And it was just sort of like, every time it's kind of like this. It was like, I always felt guilty. It was like your best friend whom you were going to hang out with, but you didn't because something cooler came along.
Yeah.
And that's a horrible person to be that.
Yeah.
But I couldn't deny, I was like, I can't turn down the Lego job. I can't turn down the Superman job. And so it's funny you asked if there was a particular moment. There absolutely was a particular moment. And I know exactly when it was. I was doing a live feed. It was during the pandemic. I was taking some sketch covers. I don't remember how it came up, but somebody asked about Shiver in the Dark on my live feed. Well, at the time, it was almost 20 years old. Somebody asked, what's going on with Shiver in the Dark? And I said, "Oh, I'd love to get back to it." And then the feed kind of took off. And I got some emails from people like, "What is this thing?" And I said, "Well, it was this comic book I made 20 years ago," and I held some up. And they said, "Well, when are you going to finish that?" And what I realized, what I didn't know, was when I made Shiver in the Dark, there were some fans of that book. Since it came out, I've made fans of my work from these other projects. There were people who maybe knew me from Lego or Superman or The Walking Dead cover or whatever, who had no idea what Shiver in the Dark was. But they were interested in what I was doing. They wanted to see basically what I've been saying all along, was they want to see what happens if I write something. So I kind of felt like, gosh, it's going to take so much work and effort to get the thing going again or whatever. And then everybody was kind of like, do it. And I looked at my wife and she said, "Yeah, I mean, the publishers aren't putting anything out. You should do it." And it was this funny thing where I was just kind of surprised by it across the board, frankly, because I thought enough time had passed and I'm a better writer. I'm a better artist. I had good ideas of things I wanted to do, but, didn't have time to get to them. And it just always felt like a thing I was neglecting. So I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, and I've been working on issue 4, if I'm going to do it, then all these people who ask what is it, they need a chance to read it. So that's why there was a 20th anniversary edition. But I went through the files. I pulled out some variant covers. There was something that was going to be a splash page from 15, 20 years ago. They ended up coloring and redrawing a face on, and that became a cover for one of the issue number 2s I made. And it just brought in a whole new audience. So it's now I have to fulfill that. But the timing of it was good because issue 3 ended on a cliffhanger. So issue 4 will make sort of a good second series number 1.
Yeah.
It's just the act of, getting it done again. And it's why the New York Comic Con kind of becomes so interesting because, a book that just came out was this one called Born of Blood.
Oh, yeah.
And this is they contacted me to make covers for it for the New York Con. So I did those. Dynamite asked me to do a cover for Alice Cooper. Well, I just did that. And so I've got a little bit of the same dilemma of, the phone rings and I get these other jobs, but I'll get the 4 done. The funny thing is I'm putting together orders because I got a lot of the Kickstarter books graded. This is one of the sketch covers.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
It's graded in this CBCS case, and I've got my custom label here, which we launched for the Kickstarter campaign. And this, because these just came back from being graded, this is a package that I'm mailing out later this week from someone who backed the Kickstarter campaign. That graded book just arrived this week.
Wow.
So it's, even though that Kickstarter was very successful and it seems like it was, a couple months ago, it's still not done.
Yeah.
Mainly the graded books took the longest to get done. And about this time next week, I will have fulfilled all the Kickstarter requests.
Nice. And that's a big undertaking because I was just looking at the campaign yesterday and reading up on it. And a huge, fully funded in 4 minutes, as the banner said. And, it far, far, far exceeded the goal. And then all these stretch goals along the way.
So I did mine a little bit differently than some people. And that was, I knew I was going to make this book. If I set my goal at a very, very modest number.
Yeah.
I pulled together the money. I said, this is my baby. No matter what, I'm going to print it. I'm going to publish it. I felt very confident I would hit the goal quickly. 4 minutes was faster than I thought I would hit it. I'm not going to lie about that.
Yeah.
That was almost miraculous. But sometimes people put together a Kickstarter and they say, I have to have the funding for this or else it can't happen. And I just didn't want to do that. Yeah. If I wasn't prepared to see it all the way through, there's no point in writing and drawing something to have it not be published. This 20th anniversary was sort of a controlled, reasonable, reprint. I already knew what the boundaries of the thing are, but the new series is a little more daunting. For example, I've commissioned Jay Lee for a variant cover for the new series, and he gave it to me, and it's great.
Yeah.
So now I got to get that done because not only are people when you see mine, but they want to see his cover. And another artist I really admire, who's a DC cover artist, agreed to do a cover for me in New York. So when this next series is ready to go, however much I promoted the 20th anniversary, it's got to be bigger for the next one.
Yeah.
But that speaks to what I was saying earlier. Every step, you're kind of ready for it. You build this stuff up. Yeah. And I want to say this. Anybody who's listening, if you're somebody who wants to write or draw or make comics or whatever, I cannot encourage you enough to do it. I've been fortunate enough to have it work for me financially and be successful as a career. But independent of that, the first 2 years that I published my comic book, I did not make money. I had a pretty good, I told you I worked in a comic book store. I had a pretty good comic book convention or collection. I sold it to fund I sold my collection.
Wow.
I bought a very expensive ad in Previews magazine. I had to buy a scanner, which at the time was expensive. Hard to believe that scanners were ever expensive. But got a computer, got my first couple print bills, had to buy tables at conventions and just get out there and sell this, $2.50 comic book. And the reason it was $2.50, because at the time, $2.95 was too much for a comic.
Yeah.
Right.
A simpler time.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, it changed my life, and there was no feeling. whatsoever, like setting up at that table and selling your first book. And, I sold it to someone and handed it to him. Oh, okay. It was like, great. I sold it and handed it to him. And he said, will you sign it? And I thought, oh, does it get any better? So, and then the only thing I want to follow up that with specifically is, in the wake of me doing that, I had a couple friends who were a little bit younger than me, and they decided they wanted to write and draw a comic themselves and sort of do what I had done. Not that they were, marching in my footsteps. I was doing what other people had done before me. This is how anybody has to make a comic book, but they had seen how it worked for me, and they wanted to do it. And so they got their booth just as I did at Wizard Chicago. It was several years after I'd done mine, but I remember they set up, and I asked them at the end of the show how they did, and they said, we didn't do that well. They were brokenhearted. They were hoping to be the next hot thing. And I said, how'd you do? And I think they told me they sold something like 40 books. And I said, hold on, wait a minute. So you raised your eyebrows. 40 is a lot.
Yeah.
And I tried to tell them, I said, look at how big and full this room is. I said, every issue of X-Men is on this floor. There's Spider-Man #1 to the newest issue here. Creators here that are just world-class stars. Garcia Lopez was there. There's David Mack. There's Brian Michael Bendis. It's like, you found 40 people who said they'd rather buy your book than anything else in this room. That is hard to do. And I really tried to convince them that they don't think they had a good show, but they had a really good show.
Yeah.
And it wasn't enough for them. And that was it. And that's okay. It's good to know what you want. But it's really difficult to get that ball rolling in that first one. And when I tell you that I didn't make money for the first 2 years, that's the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yep. It seems like that's a common thread along a lot of people that make some kind of art that they have to then sell, whether you're a musician, you're whatever. But I think specifically in the comics industry, there's a huge hurdle there of like, I have to get a physical product into someone's hands, meaning we both have to be there at the same time, or I have to mail it to them, or there's such a component there where the field of people that are likely to buy it is decreased from just broader media. If I can just get it on Spotify, then like, sure, I'll listen to your song or,
I'll
whatever.
Try it, right.
Yeah, I'll watch your YouTube video. That's one thing. But
nowadays you have to be a publisher.
Yeah.
I mean, that's shit. You really have to be a publisher. And I'll say this too. So my first show I did was at Wizard World. And I think my second one was Mid-Ohio Comic Con, which is Roger Price put that on. It used to be a really cool 2-day show. It was on. This was awful. It was on right after Thanksgiving. So it would be the Saturday and Sunday after Thanksgiving. Sounds like an odd time to have a convention, but here's what was great about it. Anybody who had a stressful family Thanksgiving, they would go to that convention 2 days later and just let off all this steam. So it was really great.
That's great.
But so I did that, and then I think my third show, if you can believe this, was Wizard Chicago again the next year.
No way.
So I only did 2 shows with my first comic book, and then was back at Wizard the next year. And here was the amazing thing. I saw this happen, and I didn't realize what had happened until I got a little bit older. But I would see creators or fans, pros, that I had seen the first year. And when I saw them the second year, they kind of looked a little surprised. A little like, oh, yeah, I remember you. You made that comic book. So what are you doing? I said, well, I'm back. I have issue 2. And they kind of acted odd. And what I found out is that here's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to put all your time and effort into making a comic book. You go to the show, you set up, you get eaten alive because you don't sell enough copies, and you quit because you're brokenhearted and you don't come back.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to my friends.
Huh.
And instead, what I did was I made a new book. I had issue 2, and I came back, and there was this surprise of kind of like, oh, you're back for more. Okay. And the funny thing about it was all the people whom were my fans from issue 1 came back for issue 2. And all the people who were new at that show who hadn't seen me the year before, they bought issue 1 and issue 2.
Yeah.
So I was selling, in some regards, double what I'd sold the year before. And my fan base was expanding. And the people who wrote me after issue 1 and said, hey, where's issue 2? I now had twice as many people writing me, hey, when does issue 3 come out?
Yeah.
And that was the ball that had to get rolling. And so it really is some kind of grassroots thing. But anybody who's trying to do this, you'll have those big disappointments up front, even if you have a big, home run hit coming out of the gate. And I think the thing that's hard in some regards, issue 2 is harder than issue 1, because when you make issue 1, all your friends and family are rooting for you. They really are.
Yeah.
And they can't believe you did it. Oh, I'll buy one, absolutely. And then after they've bought one, I bought your mug.
Right.
And you come out the next year with another mug. They feel like they've already done their part.
Yep.
They're not. Yeah, I've already given you the thumbs up, kid.
Right. Right.
If you don't have something good, it's a lot harder to sell.
Yeah.
But their first issue and second issue are really different experiences. I just loved it.
Yeah.
I still get a rush when I see a book come off the press.
Yeah.
Or I get a case and I cut it open. If I do a variant cover and I'm at a comic shop and they say, "Oh, we got your variant Joker in," and we pull them out, we're counting them up and looking at the printing, and it's the realization of the thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a unique experience that so many people don't get, to be able to walk into a comic shop, or if it's the thing that you showed, the Scarecrow action figure in your live show last night, to go into like a Walmart or a Target and see something. Like, a lot of people don't get that experience of seeing something on a shelf that they created. And so I'm sure that's a thrilling experience to see it and be like, not only did I get to create that and now I'm physically holding it, but also other people have the chance to get it and support what I do. And I know there's an audience for it.
That's cool. It's just to know you've done it. If you ever said, "I really wanted to make a comic book," and finally have it done. And I'll tell you this, I adore my wife. My wife's a really good artist. But before I met my wife, I knew she even existed. I remember it was kind of fun. I went on a date with a girl who was a sculptor, and I just about didn't know her. We had some mutual friends, but I went over to the house to pick her up, and I knew she was interested in art. And I said, "Okay, well, how am I going to introduce myself?" And we had chatted a few times. We didn't know each other that well, and I told her that I made some comic books. So I thought I should bring one, right? So there's nothing cooler than when you're trying to tell somebody what you do or what you're interested in, than to have the thing and say, "I made this."
Yeah.
And there's something powerful about that phrase. "I made this. This exists only because of me." If it's good, I'm the one who gets the praise.
Right.
If it's awful, I'm the one who takes the heat. But I remember handing it to her, and she looked at it kind of. She said, What do you mean you made this?" And I said, "I drew that. I wrote that. I published that. I had that printed. I sell that. This is my endeavor. It is all mine." And there was something about it that was just like, as it came out of my mouth in that instance, I realized that it hit different people differently. If I was at a comic book store, they expected that.
Yeah.
But to have somebody who was maybe interested in sculpture, but hadn't done a lot to think that they could mass produce something and sell it. She was like, "Well, we're both artists, but I'm not doing anything like this."
Yeah.
I make a piece and put it in a gallery. So it was pretty cool. It was a nice feeling.
Yeah.
I can't remember one time when I got when I had the Superman job. Boy, this is ridiculous. I remember being out socially and speaking with a girl, and I took a sip of my beer. She said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I draw Superman." Gulp. It was great.
That's great. That's one of those bucket list things to be able to tell somebody.
Yeah. Well, what do you do for a living? I draw Superman.
That's great. And such an exclusive club of people who can have claimed that. I mean, that's a small list.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous too. If you want to have somebody really say, "No, thank you. I'd like someone in reality, please."
Yeah.
That's a great way to get it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Do you think that on people self-publishing, I've heard that it kind of described as like this Fibonacci sequence, that kind of your first issue, a lot of people can make a first issue, and half those people can make a second issue, and half of those people can make a third issue. Do you see that pattern repeat in other creators? And I mean, it seems like for you, someone who's self-motivated and loves the thing that you're creating, you're able to press on through that and create new Shiver in the Dark stuff and create that. But do you think that is kind of the pattern, that it weeds people out purely statistically? Like, half the people just don't have it in them to go to another show and not sell as many copies as they want to?
I think it does, but I think it's also, I think that side of the equation is one that people sort of dwell on, and they forget the other side. And I do not know nearly enough about the other side, but I had heard there were several guys who were involved with Image Comics that they make that first issue and they make so much money because they own it that it's really hard to make themselves sit down and get to work on the second. There are so many things that can pull you away from getting the work done. The joke that a lot of creators say, when asked what's the hardest part of your job, they'll say it's getting myself in the chair. If I just sit down and if I can get 5 minutes into drawing, then I can work for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah.
But if you want to know the hardest parts of my job, the taxes, the travel, planning for that, the long hours at a convention, getting, I'm getting the nerve to basically have what feels like asking a stranger out on a date happens all the time. And what do I mean by that? You go to an editor and you have to present yourself. You don't know them. They've been, it's like they've been hit on all day by every other artist. And now it's your chance to try to, hit on them too.
Yeah.
And you have to do that. So those are the tough things. If I can sit down and if the runway is clear and all I have to do is draw, that's pretty great. That's pretty easy.
Yeah.
But I do think that this is a tough career in that a lot of people really dream to do it. And anytime you're dealing with something that people feel like they would do on some level just for fun, to do it professionally, competition is tough. I liken this to kind of being sort of a professional athlete.
Yeah.
And as a side story, I knew this guy who was very good at baseball and probably maybe could have played professional baseball. And he tried out at AAA. And they said, you hit well, you do everything well, but we want you to be stronger. You need more muscle. Okay. And so what happened was they asked me, so how often do you play baseball? He said, I play baseball every day. And they said, well, you don't need to play any more baseball. What you need to do is you need to go to the gym and you need to lift weights. Okay. We need you to alter your body, probably alter your diet. And you wouldn't think, well, like, gosh, I just want to play baseball. Why do I have to alter my diet? How are those related? Well, guess what? They are.
Yeah.
And that's what weeds a whole lot of people out from this. The other things that have to come along with it, what does doing all of this entail? Because there really was a time where you could just sit back at home and just draw all the time. And there are some artists who are supremely skilled that there's enough demand for them that they can kind of do that. But less and less does that happen.
Yeah.
And I see more and more instances where companies are looking for something they can sell. And it's not just your work. It's this idea. It's this product. What is the whole product? If you go to a book publisher and you say, I want to write a book about, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. And I've researched everybody and I've talked with everybody who did it. They may say, it's kind of an interesting book. Okay. But if you say, but I did it.
Yeah.
I'm someone who's done it. They'll say, okay, that's a different bend.
Right.
We can tell your story. You've got a good narrative.
Yeah.
Or particularly if you say, I'm somebody who did it. I tried to do it once. I fell. I broke my leg. I had to recover for 2 years and then I climbed it again. They say, wow, that's even a better story.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a more interesting book.
Yeah.
You're not a better climber. You're a worse climber.
Right.
You know what I mean? Your leg doesn't work as well, but it's a more captivating story. And any comic book publisher is going to look at you that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Well, I don't want to waste too much of your time or wrap up here. I have one very small, very nerdy question.
Love it.
I have always been curious on the art side when you were doing the Lego books, because the form factor of those was not the standard comic book size. If the art process itself was done on a different size than a regular issue would be, because I know there's that standard kind of size paper for regular issues.
Yeah.
I've always wondered what was there an adjustment making it like a shorter form factor?
So there's this is a story I've told this several times. I was on a but it's always good. I was on a conference call, I think with 3 members of DC and 3 with Lego. There were lots of contracts for who got to speak with whom and what the channels of communications had to be. I very rarely spoke directly with Lego. I didn't work for Lego. I worked for DC.
Yeah.
Lego hired DC to represent them. And so if I had a question for Lego, I sent it to DC, DC sent it to Lego, and that's how all of the communications went. every once in a while, if there was something that was a lot had to be discussed, we had to arrange this big conference call.
Mhm.
So we're having a conference call. I think issue 1 is ended. I'm working on issue 2. I'm about 3/4 of the way through. I might even be about done. And the conference call is ending, and somebody says, "Oh, by the way, this next issue is," I don't remember what they said, "it's 3/4 of an inch shorter." And I thought, I don't even know what that means. Like, because to me, when I think about a book's length,
Right.
I think of how many pages it is.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
Right. And so I said 3/4 of an inch shorter. And what do you mean? They said it's not going to be as tall. And if you guys have seen the Lego books, issue 0 and issue 1 are standard comic book height,
Yeah.
but they're a little bit shorter than that. And there was just kind of a not a silence on the phone, but they said, just so you know. And I thought, wait a minute, what do you mean just so I know? I've already drawn 3/4 of this.
Yeah.
And they said, well, can you change it? And I think it was one of these situations where no, you can't. It just doesn't work. I mean, can I redraw it all? Sure, but it's a little bit late in the game. We're not going to make the deadline. I don't think you want to pay me to draw it again.
Right.
And so if you look at issue 2, there's some odd props and edits on it where we moved some things around a little bit and edited as much as we could. But what ultimately happened was they had decided they were going to package the comic book as an insert within the Lego Fan Club magazine a little bit differently.
Yeah, which is how I got my first couple copies and was exposed to it, was through getting those.
Right. So what happened was they figured out that if they made the book a little shorter, rather than wrapping the whole thing in plastic, they could use little plastic tabs, 2 of them, sticky tabs, and put it in there. And I kind of thought, why are you guys making the book a smaller size just for that? Well, they told me what the savings was to make the book that way, and it was gigantic. They saved so much money. And I said, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But what was interesting was by contract, when I drew the comic book, I had to draw it on DC's own paper. And I I don't do strict black and white line art. I've got a lot of grays in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And so on a DC board, it's got blue lines printed on it for your borders and your gutters.
Yeah.
And they're called non-photo blue. And basically, if you photograph it in black and white, you can adjust levels and the blue disappears. But that really works best if you're doing black and white, not black and white and gray.
Right, right.
So we couldn't void the contract. And so I just said, well, I'm just going to draw them on the back of the paper. So I drew all mine on the back, right? It's still on the paper. And I had to adjust the size. But the other funny thing to remember is I always thought that rule was interesting that it was there because I never turned in my pages. That is to say, they never saw my physical pages. I scanned everything and I turned in digital files. So there were times where I might draw something and I'd say, you know what, I should really flip this character. And I would just draw it digitally, flip it. Wow. And so I turned in the digital file.
Yeah. So do you still have the archive of all the originals? There
are a few that are around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting because I didn't even think about that. That, if you send it all digitally, then after a point, did they say we're going to archive the originals of it? Or is it just kind of...
There was, I don't think they were terribly interested in them. I'm trying to remember. Occasionally they'd ask for, I'm trying to remember what happened. I know that they built a big statue out of Hakan based on a poster that I did. And maybe they had the digital file for that. I don't remember. So there were so many weird things that happened with the art. I think there are some sketches for that first poster that might be at DC Comics someplace. Yeah. I came into the New York Comic Con back when it was the Big Apple Con. And I just gotten the job. I hadn't even drawn anything for them. Yeah. The first thing I had to do was a poster. But I figured if I'm coming to the New York Comic Con, I should stop by DC and introduce myself. And I told my editor I'll be there. And they said, come on in. And I knew they were terrified about this job. They were very polite, but they offered me the job before they found out that the only comics I'd made were self-published comics.
Ah, okay.
And it's illegal to rescind a job after you've offered it to somebody.
Yeah.
So I said, I promise you'll make the deadline. I'll work really hard. And they said, oh, we know it. And I said, no, you don't. I know you're afraid. But so I know why they wanted me to stop by. They wanted to meet me and get a feel for me. And so the editor said, hey, let's talk about this poster, because it was really relatively narrow and tall. And we went down to a production room at DC, and they were just about closing. And you talk about, strangely nerve-wracking. I had pieces of paper, and the editor was looking over my shoulder and was like, okay, give me an idea what you think it'll look like. And I'm just drawing it and laying it all out. And Paul Levitz, who is, I think, the publisher of DC Comics, is coming in and he's turning off lights. And to this day, I think it's cool that the publisher was walking through the building to see what's going on.
Yeah. Yep.
That was cool. And he made eye contact with me and my editor, Jay. And he did this. I could tell he looked at me and he thought, I don't know who that guy is. And even though he knew Jay and I was clearly chaperoned, he walked up to me and he said, hi, I don't believe we've met. My name is Paul Levitz.
That's great.
And I shook Levitt's hand and I said, hi, I'm Stuart Sayger. I'm here working on Bionicle for you. And, it was weird because I kind of felt like, don't talk to me, talk to the editor.
Right.
I look like the trespassing guy telling a lie. So, but we did knock out some layouts there. And I think he retained those and then said, I'm going to scan these and send these into Lego right now. So, there were different things that happened and some of the art, I know there was a piece of art that was created that Lego gave away as a prize, a cover to like number 8.
Yeah.
Really, really cool personal story. I think it was the Baltimore Comic-Con, and there was a fan who, I've had a lot of big Lego fans, and this guy might have been the biggest. He was definitely up there. He brought me so many cool Bionicle things to sign. He knew so much about it. One of the things he wanted me to sign was the Lego Fan Club magazine, issue 1 and issue 2. Remember I said they came wrapped in plastic before they changed the size? He had one of those that had my issue number 1 and it's still in its original mailer unopened.
Wow.
And he asked me to sign the bag. And I said, this is totally cool. I said, this is awesome. I love you have this. I said, man, I wish I had one of these. And he said, I've got more. He pulled one out and gave me one.
No way.
I was blown away. And I said, where'd you get these? And he said, I bought them from people who were subscribers when it was new. He had archived these.
Wow.
So after I talked to him for about 45 minutes, 45, he said, do you remember there was a contest to draw a cover?
I was going to ask you about that because that, to my knowledge, is the first time that I was aware of like the art process of making comic books. There was a page of you sitting drawing and it said, submit your cover for whatever. And I have that issue that was the fan cover.
He won the cover.
No, oh, it was him.
He won it. He was the guy who had it.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
I was blown away. He said, do you remember this? And I said, yeah, I remember this. He said, I've got the cover. That's mine. It's on my wall.
Oh my
And I said,
goodness.
you're kidding me. And he said, no. And it was kind of funny because I kind of, after talking to him, I thought like, well, I can't think of anybody who's going to love it more than you will.
Right.
So,
right.
it was kind of a perfect match. I feel bad. I can't remember his name right now. It was about 3 or 4 years ago I met him. But if you're watching, I know it's got a good home. Yeah. But that was what was cool about it. I got fan mail, people telling me they liked my work. I got hate mail.
Yeah.
I say this all the time. I got hate mail from, I swear, I say 5-year-old, but he's probably 4 because I would bend the toys and make them do things that they wouldn't actually draw. And I had people telling me that I was doing it wrong. And I had others saying, I've never seen him look this lifelike. So, my opinions weren't from, bad to good. It was from bad to good. There was such a wide spectrum. People loved it and hated it.
And that probably comes from on the design side, like to an extent, I'm sure for some people, like the movies faced criticism when they made those Bionicle movies because the designs were changed from the toys and they had a different feel to them. And I think those weren't as well received from that side of people that wanted it to look like the toy. But I always felt like with your stuff, like it felt like it was the toys but moving. It wasn't that it was a departure. It was just like, this is what they would look like acting. This is what they would look like moving, and that, but
that is such a compliment. I always think here's what I tell everybody, whether you're drawing Bionicle or anything else, art doesn't have to be believable. It has to be convincing.
Yeah.
Okay. It's if it's like if you're Raphael and you're painting an angel. Or who was it? It wasn't Canaletto. Who's the who painted the floor scrapers? It's an important French painter around 1850. He said something like, I'll paint an angel as soon as I see one. but the point being is, if your art, you can paint or draw whatever you want. If it's in a convincing manner, people go along with it.
Yep.
The Lego Bionicles, when I drew them, they would bend and do things that maybe the toys wouldn't do. But if it's consistent, if the world they live in all adds up, if it all fits, then it's convincing and you go along with it.
Yeah.
It's why people complain about special effects. And I always am stunned people complain so much about special effects in a movie. The only reason I think to complain about a special effect is if it takes you out of the moment.
Yep.
If you have, nobody ever complains that the Simpsons look weird, that they're yellow and have 3 fingers.
Right.
That's its world. It's right. But I know I was drawing a different world than maybe would be represented strictly by those toys.
Yeah.
I do know that as a lot of the fans who were young, who didn't like me, got older, a lot of them have come around.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, the people who didn't like my work, they don't often come up to me as adults and tell me they don't like me. Right. They will come up and tell me, I used to not like you. I like you now. I get that.
There you go.
I'll say this, though, and I repeat this. If you're a creator of anything, music, acting, comics, whatever, I will die on this hill when I say this. It is better, far better, to make work that half of the people hate and half the people love than to make work that everybody thinks is pretty good. I really only have time for the movies, music, and comics that I love. There's so many good choices out there. The stuff I hate, I don't pay attention to that anyway. But if you really want to grab somebody, it's the thing you love that you remember that you pay attention to. And if I get half the audience that deeply, I'm much happier than a mild reaction from everybody.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And that's a great note to wrap things up on. I really appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation, and I'm sure adds a lot of insight for listeners on the art process and your story. And really, really cool stuff. So
this is great that we're doing this. You and I couldn't do this any other way than over the internet. But I'll be honest, it'd be great if we could do this in person.
Well, when I'm in your neck of the woods or vice versa, or at a con or something, I'll make sure to say hey, and we can say hey.
Where are you?
I'm in Arizona. So
a
couple hours back, but I'm from Michigan, so I'm kind of me and my wife are back and forth here and there, coming back and forth. So
I am setting up my 2023 show dates, and a show I really like going to is the Phoenix Fan Fest.
Oh yeah.
So
I've heard it's good. I haven't been, but I know it's good.
It's cool. I don't live in Phoenix, so Phoenix is terrifying to me. Only because I remember I was there one day. And I was in the convention center, and they told me that the heat had broken 117.
Yeah,
I'd never even heard of anything like that.
Halfway through October, and we're still hitting the 90s most days here. So,
I'm in Indiana, and I'm telling you, I'm putting a coat on today. So it's real.
I'm a little jealous.
For one day, I am too. I'd take 90-degree weather right now. So
fantastic.
Thanks for having me, man.
Thanks for talking. Yeah. All right. You have a great rest of your day.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.